in the global economy, we are making use for our needs of people and parts of nature that we have never met, that we've never seen. And that leads to a type of prejudice and a type of blindness that is fundamentally incompatible with both wisdom and compassion, the type of knowledge we need to treat other human beings and nature with respect, and the respect of seeing each and every moment, each and every individual as unique. And, the minute we start, that's what prejudice is, we start insisting that, this is what you're like, and we don't relate to the individual in front of us and to the moment in front of us. And we're closing down the door that allows us to feel a vibrant and energetic engagement with the universe. It's a really a terrible system, this one of long distance and separation.
Welcome to episode 22. I'm Amisha, your host. I have 3 quick reminders before we get into today's interview. My Presence mentoring program is open for applications and will begin on August the 1st. Perfect for leaders, activists, social entrepreneurs and facilitators. You can find out more information on our website if you click on events. Also on our events page is information about next week's Patronathon, where you can join us from wherever in the world you are. It would be amazing if somebody from all 88 countries in which you are listening from joined. And thirdly, if you'd like to support us in being independent and advertising free, please do become a monthly patron and contribute to making this show. You can do this directly from our community page on www.thefutureisbeautiful.co. Our guest today is the brilliant Helena Norberg-Hodge, an author and filmmaker and the founder and director of Local Futures. A pioneer of the new economy movement, she has been promoting an economics of personal, social and ecological well-being for more than 30 years. She is the producer and co-director of the award-winning documentary The Economics of Happiness, and is the author of Ancient Futures, Learning from Ladakh, described as an inspirational classic. She was honoured with the Right Livelihood Award, or Alternative Nobel Prize, for her groundbreaking work in Ladakh, and received the 2012 Goi Peace Prize for contributing to the revitalization of cultural and biological diversity and the strengthening of local communities and economies worldwide. This is an important and eye-opening interview. We discuss big picture activism, the influence the dominant corporate system has on us, and how we can create a beautiful future through awareness, localization, and not accepting the status quo. I hope that you enjoy this conversation. Welcome to The Future is Beautiful, with me, your host, Amisha Gadiali. On this show, we explore the weave between politics, spirituality, creativity, and sustainability. Every one of us has ideas and personal experiences to share that can lead us to a brighter future. Despite the challenges we face as a global community, or the pressures that we meet in our daily lives, when we stop and dare to dream, to ask ourselves the big questions and to share what we are already doing, we create the future that we wish to wake up for. That future is beautiful. I'm delighted today to be joined by Helena Norberg-Hodge. Welcome to the show.
Very happy to be here.
I'd like to start with just getting a real understanding of how much corporations affect our daily lives, because we all know that they do, and we all kind of maybe make sort of jokes about, oh, it's just the corporations, or of course they're doing that. But when you actually get down to it and you hear all the examples, it is actually really shocking.
Yeah.
And we've become a bit desensitized to it.
I would say we've become almost totally desensitized to it, because it's been going on for quite a while. And I just often wonder how people understand anything if they haven't had the experience I did of being outside of this whole system. And then as I came back from this remote part of the Tibetan plateau, things became so crystal clear. But no, we're swimming in a sea shaped by corporate desires, and we need to remember these corporations are not human beings. They're structures that are a mixture of blind reductionist thinking and ever larger scale and ever greater speed. It's almost better to think of them as this sort of money-generating machine, inside which are human beings who generally have a very limited understanding of what they're doing and the damage they inflict. But as a machine, it's a very, very powerful and destructive tool, and it's shaped our school curricula. It has shaped ever more also big science and the media. So almost every avenue of knowledge is being shaped by big money today, and I think one of the most important things we need to become conscious of. We talk a lot about consciousness, is to distinguish between that machine-like imposition on by now most of humanity, and who we really are. Who are we as human beings? What do we really want? And what is evolution? Many people confuse the process of evolution with a process of techno-economic change, which is only happening because of policies. It's happening because of political choices. They also tend to think ever more today, especially, that all of this is coming about because we humans are by nature greedy and acquisitive, and I completely differ with that. Some examples of this crazy influence is also within the environmental movement, that so much thinking has been distorted because of big money funding the big ideas.
When you talk about it as being a machine, it almost gives me this image of we watch all these like apocalyptic movies, and I don't personally watch many of them because they give me nightmares, but we think about humanity being like taken over by aliens or something, and it's almost like that's what's happened, and something else is controlling us, even though there are human beings working for these systems, that has become way more powerful than the humans.
Well, I think there is no doubt that there is a process whereby this techno-economic machine is becoming extremely powerful, and yet I think the power is entirely a function of our lack of consciousness. There is nothing inherently powerful there, and we are talking, if we look at it clearly, about a system where fewer and fewer people are winning. And, if we really step back and look at winners, yes, we can now say about 8 men have more wealth than half the global population, and that sounds like winning. But even they, have their children affected by toxic pollution and this intense stress and anxiety that's imposed, particularly now on young people. So when it really comes down to it, there are almost no winners, if any. So it's really mad if we allow this blind system to just continue mowing down life. It really is decimating life. And if people could just see clearly that the very same processes whereby we have created this alarming climate change, decimation of species, toxic pollution, that very, very same process is creating massive job insecurity, an identity crisis, and I mean literally virtually every human being that's touched by this system is influenced in a way that destroys self-esteem and a genuine sense of real confidence and empowerment. It's making a joke of democracy. It's really ridiculous in today's world to think that we have democracy, because we've got a globalized media that is spelling out the issues in a completely false left-right dichotomy that is actually no dichotomy at all. In a systemic way, left and right have been doing the same thing now particularly since the Second World War, supporting a process whereby giant multinational banks and corporations get more and more and more power, and they're now in a legal position where they're holding our governments by the neck and telling them, if you do anything at all that might reduce our profit-making potential, we will sue you. And they take them into these kangaroo courts that are, you have the same guy literally in the morning representing a corporation, and in the afternoon supposedly adjudicating in some kind of just way, in this mad situation where corporations are genuinely ruling the world and punishing governments that dare to step out of line.
So there's been some interesting examples with the tobacco companies on this.
Yeah. Well, the tobacco companies for a long time have sued, and they threaten, tiny little island states, if they dare to put anything on the packaging that this might not be good for your health, they'll be sued, by many millions of dollars. But you also have a nuclear power company in Sweden suing Germany for 3.7 billion euros because Germany decided after Fukushima to phase nuclear power out. So this nuclear power company that was planning to build lots of profitable nuclear power plants says, give us 3.7 billion. You have states and governments sued if they try to ban a toxic chemical that has been proven to be toxic and harmful to health. Under these trade treaties, they're not allowed to do that. They're going to have to pay a huge fine. So these clauses in global trade treaties which are sometimes just bilateral between two countries and sometimes multilateral, like the TPP or TTIP, which is the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership between Europe and the US. They have these clauses called ISDS, which stands for Investor State Dispute Settlements. And it's my conviction that if people knew about this, people in government, people in corporations, they would not go along with it. They wouldn't get away with pretending we have democracy or pretending that this is a capitalist system. It's not capitalist. No self-respecting capitalist believes in hidden subsidies and in regulating some businesses and not other businesses. And that's what's happening. Every place-based business, local, regional, national, are subject to ever heavier regulations, big bureaucracy, which is getting far too big, and they're squeezed for taxes. And in the meanwhile, these giants, like Apple and Google and Monsanto and Coca-Cola, move around freely, pay virtually no tax, and they're subsidized. So it really is an important story for people to wake up to.
But when you say if people knew, surely they do know.
No, absolutely not. They don't. If people have read about particularly this really dark secret about trade treaties of these clauses where they sue governments, vast majority of people don't know about it. People who do, economists and finance ministers and so on, we don't yet have a new economy movement, or if we want to call it a people's movement that is concerned about both human rights and the environment, laying out clearly on a silver platter, look, these treaties lead to this and this and that, and fundamentally to destruction of livelihoods, loss of identity, completely linked then in turn to epidemics of depression and anxiety. And they're driving up emissions at every turn. They're massively increasing the need for transport, packaging, and therefore the mountains of plastic. This is what these treaties are leading to. No, most people are not being forced to see that big picture. And that's why I'm so committed to what I call big picture activism, because there just isn't enough of it.
So for those of us that don't work in government,
Yeah.
how do we integrate this knowledge into the way that we live?
Well, see, this is I think we need to be thinking about how did the organic movement start? Where did it come from? People became aware that the mode of agriculture that our governments were supporting against both left and right, they were subsidizing energy, chemical-intensive agriculture that was leading to, toxic food as well as destroying the land and wildlife. So what happened is more and more people started saying, this is not right. And in fact, most of those people were neither farmers nor in government. They were the average consumer, the average citizen who started raising the alarm. And in fact, if I look in my international work, most of them weren't even people who had particular knowledge of pesticides or botany or agriculture. They were just concerned citizens who didn't want to see their children eating toxic food, and they didn't want to see the land destroyed. And they started gathering together, they started speaking about it, they started writing about it, and worldwide have been able to have an impact on government. But so for me, civil rights movement, same thing. Without the help of that sort of average, usually middle-class citizen who had a little bit of time and ability to do something, that civil rights movement wouldn't have happened. It certainly wouldn't have come from government, and it wouldn't have come just from black people themselves organizing. There was the support and the movement building that made it possible for such a big shift. And the interesting thing is that, in looking at the civil rights movement, at the organic movement, at the women's movement, what happened in South Africa with apartheid and all that, we're talking about movements that came out of a more specialized concern and a smaller segment of the population than what this new movement can represent. Because this movement we need for a fundamental shift away from corporate rule to genuine democracy really is something that benefits everybody. So we have a potential to build a movement that is more powerful than ever before. And we see that in our work, that even here at this course I've just been teaching at Schumacher College, such a broad range of people from, in this case I think we had about 8 different countries, different ages, different backgrounds. Some of them were what I call corporate refugees. Some of them, out of 25 people, I think there were about 8 who have either already left their corporate work or are thinking of doing so. So there is this coalition building growing, and it's between, a whole range from those primarily interested in the spiritual, deeper psychological issues and benefits, and in meditation, yoga, personal healing, to those interested in women's rights, in so-called third world development and poverty, in unemployment and economic dislocation right here. So across the whole board, coming together, not to suddenly merge into one organization, but singing to the same hymn sheet, recognizing that for all those issues, making this economic transition would solve this multitude of problems. And that's why it's so empowering. I mean, it's a big task trying to persuade people of big picture activism, mainly because people feel that this big system is just too big to even comprehend, but maybe most of all, they feel it's too big to change. That's the big obstacle we have.
I mean, I had an experience just been driving around the southwest this week, and driving from Oxford to Bristol, there's a wonderful service station that I don't know what it's called, but it doesn't have any of the normal shops that you have in a service station. It's a big farm shop, and they've got a little outside bit where you can sit, and they've got a little kind of bit of water, and you can see all the mountains, the hills. So actually, it's a very clever bit of architecture where you sit out and have your food, and you're like right in the middle of the beauty of the nature that you're in. And your tea and coffee is cheaper, or you get loyalty stamps if you've got your own keep cup, and they sell the keep cups, and there's nothing, everything's independent in the entire place. I was just so excited. It felt like it was so rejuvenating to be able to stop and actually be where I am, rather than be in these kind of, these fake worlds of like the service station where you're going to have the same chain, and you're not going to be able to find something as nourishing as you want, and you're not going to be able to just sit in nature and just recharge a little bit. And I was so excited. It just gave me this glimpse into another world that's possible.
Absolutely.
And I'm determined I'm going to go and find out who's behind that service station and interview them and find out how they did it.
Yes. And so often it's just about the vision and the understanding that there is a thirst for this. So there are several myths out there that keep getting reiterated. One of them is that this system is there because that's what we want. We're creating it. It's constantly hear people saying, we are doing this, we're trashing the planet, and then you hear in the climate movement, how can people be so stupid and resistant? They know about climate change, why aren't they changing? And that discussion, that framing never discusses the real reasons behind climate change. It's just pointing the finger at the individual consumer and citizen who is a victim of corporate machinations. And they don't even know about redundant trade, that most countries are routinely importing and exporting the same product in larger and larger quantities. So the UK exports milk and butter and imports in roughly the same quantities. The US exports about 1 billion tons of beef and turns around and imports about 1 billion tons of beef. So all of this is the main reason behind climate change, and that's not even being discussed. So yes, once you wake up to the bigger picture, and what you then discover is that this is not happening because people want it. There is such a clear sign that people long for something else. They long for something that is essentially more human, who we are, how we evolved. We evolved in much more human scale communities. We evolved much more deeply connected to nature. And so in us is this deep longing. And so we can see that people who can afford it will generally, of course, choose organic, local food. But when we're in a system where we have these hidden subsidies that make Walmart food cheaper than local fresh organic food, then it's not strange that people are choosing the cheaper, because they're at the same time being squeezed, horribly squeezed, as they pay more and more for their rent or for their mortgages. So it's what people want, and I bet you that will be immensely successful. The problem is that in a system of hidden subsidies and so on, it can be difficult to get something like that started. And how do you reach people? How do they know about it? Because again, our governments, left and right, both parties, are supporting superhighways with special turnoffs for the whole McDonald's world. And that artificial world we go into, which is like, it's a very good example, because I was in one of those mainstream ones recently, and it is frightening. The lack of anything resembling natural, the commercial and ugly, and even the smell of the trans fat oils. I mean, it's like, it really is the ultimate in the artificial world,
and how much
created
plastic.
for profit for the few, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing. And then sometimes as consumers, we get blamed. Well, you're choosing the imported thing, and it's like, well, if the imported thing is half the price of the local thing, then a lot of us have to choose that, and it is very luxurious to be able to have local fair trade products.
Yeah, but beware also of the propaganda that therefore says that's elitist, when in fact we should be talking about the elitism for corporate profit. In other words, why are we helping to create ever bigger, fatter billionaires and giant corporations, and creating job insecurity and incredible stress and competition, particularly on young people who now are already in a situation where having their own home or having any kind of job security seems, an absurd and unreachable goal. So it really is very high time that we step back and look at this economic system for what it is.
And the relationship between this system and the urbanisation that's happening as well.
Yes, yeah. Well, I'm very glad you brought that up, because that's something that, particularly in the West, most people absolutely don't see. If you do spend time in India or China or many places in the so-called global south or so-called third world, there you will see that urbanization is a major consequence of this globalizing, corporatizing economy, one where the trade treaties are rolling out the red carpet for giant mergers. So it's not big enough to be Exxon, you've got to become ExxonMobil. It's not big enough to be Monsanto, you're merging. And this path of giants merging is completely linked to a massive shift in population from smaller towns and cities into mega cities. If you think about it too, McDonald's can't provide food in every tiny village of India. There's an efficiency in having these concentrations of population, and at the same time, those big businesses lobby governments to expand the infrastructure, the giant ports, the giant airports. It's all part of that picture. And every step of the way, it increases the ecological footprint per capita. But there are all kinds of pseudo-study. Again, this is big money funding big science at many universities. There are studies that will show us that, oh, no, cities are the most efficient way for us to live. We're even getting propaganda that high-rise agriculture is efficient. I mean, even a child would step back and say, really? Do you want to build a building of, 50 or 100 floors and then try to grow food in this way? It's just absolutely crazy. But without the global picture and without seeing, I think, the rapid urbanization in the global south, it's sometimes harder to see it in the West. Even though, if I look at my native country of Sweden, since I grew up there, the population has barely changed. It's not increased dramatically, but certainly the demographic pattern has. Because again, over the years, jobs have been concentrated in fewer and fewer large urban centers, and small towns, medium towns, and even industrial towns have died as the giant multinationals keep roaming the world for the cheapest labor. So they've taken industry out of the industrial world and plopped it down in China and India and so on. And in the end, with all of that massive increases in fossil fuel use and pollution. But I want to remind the listeners also that when you talk about the corporations in this way, it's really hard to distinguish between well, not really hard. Many people don't distinguish between the people inside the corporations and what these corporations are doing.
Mm-hmm.
But you got to remember, something like McDonald's is like a whole empire it's like a whole country, and in fact wealthier than many countries. And so you have the little citizens inside who have really no idea of the overall impact. And I have found even at the level of CEOs, they are conveniently not seeing the bigger picture. And it's also not that easy to see the big picture today, because when all of us, whether citizens or CEOs or consumers or CEOs, when our footprint means that, when I go to the shop and I buy my shoes, and they've been made in Vietnam, I have no idea about the resources of the people. I really can't know whether this is done in a truly sustainable and humane way. Well, same with the CEO. It's very easy to be irresponsible in that system, and rather difficult to be responsible.
Yeah, I've done a lot of work in the sustainable fashion world, and I've spoken to sustainability managers or sourcing managers from big high street companies, and they're like, well, we do go on these audits, but there's almost like a kind of fake factory that's presented during those audits that is not the reality of how those clothes are actually being made. And what do you do? Because no one can really speak out. They need the work, they need those jobs, and so everyone's kind of trapped. Everyone's in the lie, and everyone kind of knows they're in the lie. Yeah. But how do you get out of it? Because we're so invested in it. It becomes a bit like Plato's cave.
And actually, I met the head of the Gap one point. I was with my friend Doug Tompkins, who used to run one of these big multinationals, Esprit, and he had become a localist, and we were trying to talk to other people who had a lot of influence and wealth. But I remember so well when we met the head of the Gap and tried to talk to him about what was actually going on. He was so incensed because he said they sent people out, and we were talking about the slave labor in Southeast Asia and so on, and he said they regularly sent people out to check. But of course, just as you say, all the workers are told, if you dare say a peep, when the inspectors come, you're out. And of course, a lot of stuff that would be going on regularly would not even be there. But probably the last person to know the truth about it would be the CEO. Mm-hmm. He was never out there himself on inspection, and so there is a way in which, paradoxically, in the highest places of power, you're most dependent on mediated information, and so it's easiest to escape the responsibility of looking at the big picture. And in fact, you can't really look at anything except through mediated information, and often numerical information, which simply distorts the truth.
It's frightening, and there is that feeling of like, it is too big. How have you managed to stay resourced in continuing your work, like on a personal level? And also, how does it feel to have been working on something for 40 years? And I'm sure you've seen, there's been smaller things that have shifted in positive ways, but overall it has all become bigger. How has that felt for you?
Well, from the very sort of start was, I had the great privilege of living in Ladakh or Little Tibet, and my life was divided up for many years of being 6 months out there, and then for about 2 months of the year I would whiz around Europe and North America, completely involved in the sort of environmental movement, giving talks, even a few at the World Bank and the IMF and at Harvard, and I was invited to teach for a while at the University of Berkeley. So that grounding for 6 months of the year, sort of walking wherever I needed to and doing very satisfying work, working with renewable energy and bringing information about the Western model. So we helped to start an organic movement in Ladakh, and we managed to attract all the leaders. That work was very satisfying and very grounded. And so I do feel very privileged, first of all, that I had the experience of the traditional culture, and which has grounded me so firmly in a complete conviction about human nature being that every child that's born prefers to be loved and cared for and nurtured, and if given that nurturing and love, tends to enjoy loving and caring and nurturing. So that I would argue that, yes, we all have the potential to become selfish, egotistical, and even violent, but our preference is for loving and peaceful relationships. And it was so clear that that is so much more satisfying for people. So I encountered the happiest people I had ever encountered. I learned to speak the language fluently, and over many years I witnessed what happened to the very same people who had been just radiantly active and joyous. And I saw how this dominant economic system affected people negatively, which of course was heartbreaking, but it gave me this, absolute conviction, not in the ability to say that any human or anything in the living world is good or bad. This is part of the wisdom teachings through the years, is that, we might not like that poisonous snake, but if we have the hubris to think that is bad and we're going to eliminate it, we are simply wrong. There's an interwoven dance, a cosmos, which we often describe as consisting of both the shadow and the light, or good and evil. So within that balance of life, we cannot stand in judgment and say, this is bad, this is good. But what I discovered over the years in Ladakh is that we can say very clearly that a way of structuring our economy, and with it our politics, that encourages greed and avarice, and that massively increases the ecological destruction, favoring very few over the very many, that is a system that, well, I call it evil. It's an evil system. And to me, that distinction is very, very important. And that is what I've tried to share. And I guess I've felt probably in the, I'm trying to think now, probably about 15 years ago, I felt more disheartened than I do now, because I'd say in the last 15 years, there is a very clear increase in the number of people who start focusing on this economic shift. And it's an economic shift in that it's the enormous man-made techno-economic system that needs to be transferred away from, taking us further and further from nature, always towards its monoculture, human consumer monoculture, biological monocultures with the fishery, farming, forestry, so on. And that direction needs to be changed towards life-affirming ways of living. So the solutions are not, strictly speaking, economic. It's not all about the economy. It's about life, and it's about a path that takes us away from life, and a life-affirming path towards that deeply life-affirming path, which is human life as well as everything else that lives. It's a path that can generate and renew genuine human and ecological well-being. So having seen those two paths very clearly, and having tried to lay them out and trying to mobilize people, was hardest probably as globalization in its new incarnation took off in the mid-80s. It was really getting difficult by the mid-90s to talk about these things. But then, certainly since 2008, it's become a lot easier after financial crisis. So I feel encouraged by the shift in thinking that's so clearly going on. For me, again, it becomes clearer when I see it happening in every country, when I meet, so many environmentalists who never, well, who felt the economy was something they didn't understand, or it was somebody else's business. But now there's more and more and more consensus about looking at that. But maybe most of all, what keeps me going is knowing that when I first started promoting what I call localization as an antidote, with a focus on local food, I was often met with ridicule. They say, "Oh, Helena, yes, we know, Ladakh, nobody's going to go back to just eating local. We like to have our strawberries in winter, and it's a nice idea, but just, keep quiet about it." And it's been very, very satisfying to see how much it's growing, even though many people may not even remember that we were the pioneers in many countries, helping to get the first initiative started. And it's been every single day I get more information about new localization initiatives, particularly around food, from the most wonderful projects, like right here on the estate at Dartington. There's one with prisoners that are able to come out of prison, learn to garden, they learn to cook for the first time in their life. And for the first time in their life, they sit down in community, and it is healing. The recidivism rate is absolutely, clearly, dramatically lower. It's just, a win-win-win recipe. And local food is at the heart of a broader localization movement, where there are also local business alliances that are starting to happen, and much greater concern on the part of the average citizen and consumer about trying to support local business. So you also have groups coming together to do community energy initiatives, and very importantly, local finance mechanisms. And one of our close colleagues, Michael Schumann from America, is an expert in this, and he's been able to work now increasingly with local governments, even regional governments. So there's this trickling up of awareness that's extending to local governments. So you can also see mayors in many parts of the world who are, again, structurally more connected to the local. They can see more of the problems, and they can see more of the benefits of localizing. So there is the world is moving in two opposing directions. And when you're in tune with that, what feels and sounds like very small initiatives, they are small, but when you see how they're multiplying, and every day you get news of them, as I do, that's certainly a very big part of what keeps me going.
It's beautiful. Yeah,
I would say the beautiful world we want is being born. And the big danger is that many of the things that start out often with a struggle, remember they're operating in a sea of heavy subsidies in the wrong direction, and regulations that are often purposefully there to destroy the small. Starting them can be a struggle, but as they start growing, people love them. Now, the big problem is that often they keep growing and become too big. And so scale and local is very, very important that we be aware of that, along with organic or natural. And I guess what I'm seeing is that with these localization initiatives that are about this fundamental reconnection to others and to nature, there is just, there is always, I find, almost without exception, that it's healing for people, and that it can turn people around who have sometimes a lifetime of drug addiction or depression. There's such a deep healing that happens. And it's astounding. I was talking about the prisoners early, many of whom have been angry and perhaps even violent their whole lives, can be turned around And the medicine, the cure, is essentially learning from, what I call ancient futures. It's about learning from a deeper, more nature-based, community-based way of living. And actually I want to say one more thing about that, and that is that many of these initiatives start from the cities. It's not about having to live out in a small town or village to do any of these things. The initiative often comes from the big cities themselves.
Why do you think that is, having studied different examples?
Oh, I think I see a real pattern there. There are many ways of justifying that when people have been living for a while, now it varies how long, but certainly after some generations, in high-rise, high-density, no nature, no community living, an appetite for community and nature develops. So we can see how the environmental movement arose out of industrialization. Mm-hmm. And we can see how environmentalism, conscious environmentalism, grew out of the industrialized countries, not so much out of the countries that hadn't been so industrialized. And you can see even now in places like India and that out of the big cities there is now also that awareness growing of wanting to live closer to or connect more deeply to nature and to community.
Mm-hmm. So it's about holding the big picture, yeah, and realizing how much of our lives, our thinking, like everything that we take for granted is being influenced. Even our schooling, all of these things are completely being influenced by the big corporations. And so seeing that and just knowing it's there and then doing whatever we can on a local level.
Well, I think, again, there's an intermediate step there, mm-hmm, that I really would like to encourage people to engage in, and that is that when you see that bigger picture, meaning both that the corporate control of everything we care about is destructive and how it works and why it works, and also, hopefully, as part of that, learning about the localization initiatives. There is a big picture to share with others. So there is this way in which people often, with their action, think, okay, so now I know that, now I'm going to go and live the local, I'm going to go and be the local. But I would like to encourage people to, yes, do what they can, be and live the local, but also do what they can to get that information out. It's visionary information. It's showing a sort of invisible world, because the sort of strings whereby we're almost pulled like puppets on a string by an invisible hand of this distant global economy which operates through our governments often, we don't see that. So it's this invisible hand, and the destruction of it, so much of it is invisible too, because whether it's the toxic chemicals and the rise in cancer, the rise in loneliness, depression, addiction, all of those are not visible. And then equally, the very real world, the renewal, regeneration of all the new farmers markets and all kinds of very positive developments that can also be shown to increase community, reduce depression, anxiety, heal an ecosystem, because they're small and because we do not have a media and avenues of knowledge that support this. That's also invisible. So making those two sides of the world visible, the one we don't want, the ugly world, the polluting world, and the beautiful world that we do want, there's all kinds of activism, and doing a podcast like you're doing is a beautiful example of it.
Yeah, and trying to find that balance, I mean, with the podcast, of talking to people that are thinking about the big picture, and people that are doing things with their hands, and because I find there's so much richness, and we need to kind of come out of these like silos and
exactly
and realize that we're capable of so much more like each one of us than we have any idea that we are.
Exactly.
And if we can remove ourselves from essentially where the system's trying to kind of numb us out, then we discover a capacity in ourselves much bigger than we realised we had.
Particularly when we consciously try to move away and change the I to a we, so that we consciously try to connect with a few like-minded people. It's really important to do that. Because once we sort of change the I to a we, and we sort of interact and discuss and support one another, then we have far greater courage and confidence in reaching out to try to spread the word to other people. It's also, I think, even if we're going to take an initiative, getting out of the modality of, what can I do in my little frame as an individual, keeps it very limited, in terms of how I spend my buying dollars and so on. Whereas once we're a group, we can actually create initiatives that go beyond this global market and start creating those initiatives that I was talking about.
And actually these initiatives are things that touch the very essence of what we value the most. And no matter where we are on a political spectrum, we can actually find unity on these different small things.
Exactly. I mean, you see it all the time. I mean, for me, I've seen it in so many of the farmers' markets we've helped to start. Very often the farmer, the small farmer, would have been quite conservative and believe the experts that been telling them, you've got to have more chemicals, you've got to have more machinery, you've got to go into debt to do this, and this is the way to go. And then these sort of greeny hippies, they didn't have much time or respect for them. But once you have a farmer's market, and suddenly here are these people who happily will eat a carrot even if it isn't straight, and they even prefer to see a few blemishes on the apples, knowing there haven't been chemicals. You suddenly have this coming together of former polar opposite value systems and people in this interdependence that is both profoundly human and profoundly ecological. So, and it happens also in terms of racial prejudice, when there's the shopkeeper happens to have a darker skin color and the local people get to know them, they realize that all these ideas about what people are, people you've never met, disappear, and we become human, and we become appreciated genuinely for who we are as individuals. So long distance, and essentially in the global economy, we are making use for our needs of people and parts of nature that we have never met, that we've never seen, and that leads to a type of prejudice and a type of blindness that is fundamentally incompatible with both wisdom and compassion, the type of knowledge we need to treat other human beings and nature with respect, and the respect of seeing each and every moment, each and every individual as unique. And the minute we start, that's what prejudice is, we start insisting that this is what you're like, and we don't relate to the individual in front of us and to the moment in front of us. It deadens us. We're closing down part of who we are, and we're closing down the door that allows us to feel a vibrant and energetic engagement with the universe. So it's a really a terrible system, this one of long distance and separation. There's so much more to say about it, but
what about these lives that a lot of us live where we are physically quite close from our family or even our closest friends, maybe travelling quite a lot for work? Like, some of the most interesting people that I know that are kind of really in tune with a lot of this also are quite mobile in their lifestyles.
Yes. Yeah. No, actually, I have found that, first of all, I've found that usually it's people who've had international experience, or at least the broad experience of deep experiential knowledge of life closer to the land and to nature and community. In other words, in less sort of developed areas, as well as the urban, industrial, developed consumer lifestyle. When people have experienced both sides of that divide, they're usually much more aware of the system that's driving this change. Also, I'm absolutely convinced that we need much more international exchange and communication, real information, reality tours in both directions for people to understand what's going on. Because we're being fed, we're being fed with the myth of these poor people over there who have nothing. And it's because we don't talk about the value of community. We don't talk about the value of having lots of time. We don't talk about the value of having lots of skills. We don't talk about the value of having, a way of life where everybody can sing and dance and play music and not feel self-conscious. We don't talk about the wealth of having, being able to grow up surrounded by many significant others instead of being isolated in the nuclear family. We don't talk about the value of a life where we move a lot and use our bodies and our hands. We don't talk about the value of, in most of these more land-based traditional cultures, there were also spiritual traditions that reminded people of how sad and unhappy you become when you become full of greed and avarice and think that you need to grasp and hold on to things. The spiritual traditions reminded people of the joy of giving and sharing. And in those more traditional cultures also, there was, in almost everyone that I know of, there was also a practice of stilling the chattering mind, so that, whether it was meditation or yoga or chanting together is a meditative practice. So that wealth has been completely dismissed and basically is considered zero. And then we have this same system that's pulling us by these threads, measuring success in a way that it's called GDP, it's called growth, and actually, for the majority of people, it's not growing their budget. The average person is getting poorer. Even in the middle classes in Sweden or in America, people are getting poorer. There may be more money, but the rent and the mortgage cost more. Everything they need costs more. So they're running faster and faster and faster. Both mother and father have to work. And then by the time they paid for the child care and et cetera, they are impoverished. And they are particularly impoverished when it comes to all those things I just mentioned. Time, singing and dancing, moving, and also feeling the satisfaction of producing something that you know is useful and you can see the product of what you do in your work. Again, that's been lost through this supposed progress that we really have to reject.
And a lot of it is around what society values. So, for example, I'm doing this podcast. I don't want advertising money because I want this to be an independent, exploration that has no rules around what can be said and what can't be said. And a lot of people are like, well, it's not sustainable because, it's opened up to a crowdfund. So lovely listeners that are donating £5 a month, but it doesn't add up to the amount of time that me and the team spend making it. And so sometimes when I do projects like this, I feel like there's a sense of failure, that I'm failing by the lines of society because it's not a real thing, because it's not paying the bills.
Yeah.
And then I think, well, yeah, I probably spend 2 days a week doing this, and I could be spending that time, you know, watching TV or going to the pub or doing all kinds of other things where I wouldn't be being paid, but that would be okay because that's not work.
Yeah.
And it's kind of interesting, like for me, I want all of my time, even my social time, to be contributing to this more beautiful world, this more beautiful future. But it involves quite a big shift of acceptance of going against the status quo.
And that's also, again, why it's so important to connect with like-minded others, so that you start building a culture of mutual support and respect. And because, yes, it's true, blindly and it's deeply ingrained. You know, we started off talking about how this corporate culture influences us, and in the deepest way it makes people identify with the work they do, and if that work is successful, they'll be earning a lot of money. And I see even very thoughtful, intelligent people ashamed. I mean, particularly I know some people who've inherited a bit of money and who don't need to work, and they're so ashamed of it. You know, I keep saying to them, see it as this huge gift to be able to do something really meaningful, and don't be depressed about this and self-doubting, but just see the huge opportunities here. We can give you a whole raft of meaningful activities, like a podcast like this, that you can do and even fund a bit to get the word out. And you're really doing work, real work, for the real world, for real benefit. But it's very hard to get over those dominant pressures. I mean, I'm also just amazed at how vain I still am. I mean, as a young woman, I was too concerned with, you know, whether my hair was right. And I lived in Ladakh for 6 months without any mirrors. It was such a blessing and such a relief. But I find when I'm back in the West, I'm still checking in the mirror. You know, in a way, and at my age, you know, all of that is programming from a dominant system that makes us so self-conscious. And I didn't even start singing till I was 60, because I always thought, I'm afraid I'm going to get it wrong, and I was worrying about spoiling it. It wasn't that I wanted to be perfect, but I didn't want to spoil the singing for other people, and so I was just sort of mouthing the words. And that's another huge deprivation in the name of progress and wealth, that we've all been trained to think we can't sing.
Because we all have voices, and actually singing has traditionally been a way of bringing community together.
Absolutely. I think it's one of the most important ways, and that's also why most churches and spiritual traditions have some form of chanting and singing, because it's a wonderful way of experiencing a sense of deep oneness, and it really is a profound experience of hitting the same note with a whole group of people together. It's profoundly spiritual, profoundly connecting in a very, very important way.
I'm curious, as in that 6 months that you didn't look in the mirror, what was your inner sense of beauty? Like, did you ever think about it, or did you just feel comfortable in your skin?
Not so much. I wouldn't say that I would have felt particularly comfortable in my skin, but I would say that when I was there, I felt much more comfortable in my skin, because I wasn't reminded of what I looked like. The most terrible thing is to see yourself on video or something. I don't think we humans were meant to do that. It's always just awful. And of course, I love an ancient saying, you know, in this Tibetan culture, which is that tiger's stripes are on the outside, but human stripes are on the inside. And what they're saying is that our characteristics and who we are, it's all inner. And it goes hand in hand with living in a way where you have more proximity to significant others who you know over time, and then what they look like becomes, minute by minute, the longer you know someone, their appearance becomes less important, and whether they have a sense of humor, whether they're kind, whether they're intelligent, whether they're, like-minded, all of these things become important. So those inner stripes. And I also found that in that more human scale, longer term community way, every child got seen and heard by many significant others, which is very important. The nuclear family is a disaster. And by having a sort of a basket of relationships, the child had the need to be seen and heard, appreciated, loved, satisfied, and that it creates this deep security that allows for genuine individualism. So it's so paradoxical that we think in the West that we have this individualistic system. We have a system that's very separating, and that creates a sense of loneliness and also deep anxiety, because we're being pressured by this big system to be perfect, to just, be like the models that are inherently white and Western, and we're all supposed to look the perfect role. And it was interesting to me to see this having an impact in Ladakh and Bhutan and affecting young children very quickly and very extremely. And back then it was literally Barbie doll for girls and Rambos for boys. And you saw these terrible effects on the young. It took me a while to realize that, going back to Sweden, the blonde, blue-eyed ideal had even greater damage, because even though the average Swedish girl was blonde and blue-eyed, there were eating disorders that led to, young girls literally killing themselves by refusing to eat or becoming bulimic. And for me, one of the most heartbreaking things is that without the big picture, we blame ourselves or we blame the other. So there I had a friend in Sweden whose daughter was bulimic, and there were the counselors, the psychiatrists, the doctors, the nurses, all blaming my friend, saying, you were too concerned with your weight. Nobody was there talking about the bigger picture and explaining that without the media and without this dominant system, those eating disorders simply did not exist.
Yeah, I'm really happy you said that, because I know that a lot of our friends listening have jobs in corporations and mortgages and all of these pressures, and are very much in that. And as we're talking, you could feel a sense of shame that somehow you've become implicit in this thing.
Yeah.
And just acknowledging that, yes, as humans we can do all these things, and we can shift our patterns and do all of this, but we also are, it's strong, the system that we're in, and it's all consuming. It comes in from every angle. Turn on the media, turn on this, you go past the billboards, it's just constant. And so with that, it's like we can also give ourselves a break.
Oh, absolutely. I really feel that's also incredibly important for me, is that if we understood the system better and how it affects us, we would not be so hard on ourselves. And nor would we be thinking that if we recycle our plastic, that we should be pointing fingers at people who aren't doing it. Those are very small steps in any case, but, the finger pointing and the blame for individuals, as I say, even inside the corporation, is just not productive. Because, when we think that this is all about good guys and bad guys, then we think, well, let's just put a good person in as the head of this corporation. No, we need systemic change, and that is what's being discussed in the new economy movement, and there are, luckily the recognition is growing that this is not about good guys and bad guys, and it's not at all productive to be blaming ourselves or others. What I urge people to do is, either stay completely in their corporate job or ease their way out, maybe liberate themselves one day a week to do something else that could be more genuinely supporting both themselves and the planet, and maybe do half if that's possible, and of course where it's possible to do something completely different, that's great. But the problem is that too many people wanted to save the world while still earning a good salary, and it's really perverted a lot of the environmental movement. Because most of the things that are really worthwhile, like your podcast, are not likely to be well funded. It's changing a bit, and we can hope that it will change more. There's definitely, as the awareness grows, there are more foundations, there are more people willing to fund crowdfunding things and so on. But we've got to be really all the time looking at whether we're supporting the dominant system or not. And as I say, even if we are, let's not blame ourselves, but let's do what we can to share and really inform and educate as much as we can, so we can start building up more collective ways of changing. Now, that collective way of changing can start with local initiatives, particularly around local food and the rest of the whole localization movement. But even if you can't have the time to go and shop at the farmer's market, you could do something like give a $5 donation to those groups that are setting up new schemes, new edible schoolyards, something in that direction. And you could support organizations that are trying to get out this bigger picture.
Thank you so much. It's been so wonderful to talk to you
today. Thank you.
And your website for us to find out more?
Is localfutures.org. Local Futures. Yeah, there's a lot more there. The film, The Economics of Happiness, and my book, Ancient Futures, and a lot of materials also for, things that you might do individually. We're connected, to a whole network, and so I hope people will look at it.
Absolutely, and we'll post links to everything that you've mentioned as well to make it really easy.
Good, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening. As always, you can find links to everything we mention in this episode, download our book, and discover so much more over on the blog. We don't believe in selling you things you don't need through this podcast, and so it's made possible by you, our community. If you loved this and would like to contribute to our Patreon campaign or join our online group to connect with other listeners, please visit www.thefutureisbeautiful.co and click on community. Please also hit subscribe and leave us a review on iTunes so we can grow. Here is to us, creating a beautiful future together.